Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and thank you for watching IT Pro TV, helping you learn everywhere you go. I am your host, Zach Memis, for this episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. In this episode, Advanced Permissions. And we've asked our expert in the field in the studio, and everywhere he goes, Don Pizzette, to tell us more. Don, good to see you, sir.
Hey, glad to be back. Being here. And taking a look at advanced permissions.
Advanced permissions.
We got a chance in the last episode to learn about normal permissions, and so now we're going to go a step further because there's always these little scenarios that we run into where we can't get something done based on what's what is readily available. So we have a couple of tools and techniques we'll look at in this episode that allow us to do more advanced configurations, and there's also some special permissions that we really didn't talk about in the last episode at all that I want to follow up on and cover right here. So all that's coming up right here in this episode.
So, Don, what limitations do we have with basic permissions?
All right, the biggest limitation that we have, and most of you have probably already spotted it, is the fact that we can only assign one user and one group to have permissions on a file. And then after that, everything else goes into that other column. So that creates a bit of a problem. For example, here, let me bring up my directory that we were working with in the last episode. So I have these 5 files, or 6 files now, and they're all owned by me, and I've got the sales department set as the group that has access. Okay, now that's fine if I need to be the owner and I want all these different people in sales to access the files. I'm in good shape. But I have a marketing department. And what if I want the marketing department to also have access to these files? Well, I'm kind of out of luck, aren't I, right? Like, I'm the owner, so that doesn't help. Then sales is the group, and I can't take away sales and change it to marketing because then that breaks apart the sales team's access. And I don't want to take my marketing people and put them in sales because then why bother having the groups in the first place if everybody's getting lumped together into one big group? So it doesn't give us the flexibility to go in and create additional dynamics. In fact, with the old permission style like this, the only option I would have if I wanted marketing to have access would be to assign access to the other group, right? Remember, we've got the user or the file owner. We've got the group, which in my case is sales. That's the next 3 values. And then we've got the other. And on file1.txt, my permissions are set to read. So the marketing team would have read access to file 1 because they would fall into that other group. But they wouldn't have any access to files 2 through 6. So I could come in and say, all right, I'm going to make the other have read access on all those files too. But I wouldn't be giving permission just to marketing. I would be giving permission to every other group that I had. I have marketing and sales. Maybe I have another like accounting department, right? So if I just do a quick, here, I'll do a sudo group add, and we'll do accounting, right? So here's this new group that I've got. When I assign permissions to that other category, accounting is going to get it as well. So the way permissions are handled inside of the Unix platform, the really original kind of where all this stuff started, is fairly limited because back then access was limited. You didn't have that many people that needed access to systems. But in today's world, where you'll probably be in companies that have thousands of employees, that have numerous departments and divisions, and the accounting department might be broken up into other groups inside of it, you will constantly bump into this limitation of not being able to assign more than one group to the file, and that creates a real challenge that we've got to find a way to overcome.
So how can we overcome those limitations?
All right, well, we have a new technology that comes in, and it doesn't replace the old permissions, it adds on to it. We have what are called file system ACLs, or access control lists, all right? And a file system access control list, or FACL, that's what it's abbreviated to, FACL. What FACLs do is they allow us to assign extra stuff. You still have the UGO. That doesn't change, right? Those are always going to be there. That's for Unix compatibility. But then we can add more users and more groups. We can actually get a lot more advanced and more granular and picky and so on. Right now, I can only have one owner. I'm the owner of this file. But I want Zach to be an owner as well. Well, maybe not an owner, but at least to have read, write, and execute on it. Not some group, just Zach. I can't do that with UGO, but I can with a FACL. I can come in and I can allow and assign that and put it in place. If I want marketing and sales to have access to that file, I can do that. What a FACL does is it basically just creates additional lines, additional entries into that list of permissions to allow us to do that. ACL is access control list. You're creating a list of who has access, and it's made up of access control entries or ACEs, and those ACEs are individual people or groups, and that gives us a ton of more flexibility.
Are Fackles available in all distributions?
You know, they aren't,
Uh-huh.
and I wish there was a pattern or a formula I could tell you. Most distributions actually do support Fackles, but they don't all have them turned on. So you may find where your system needs to have it enabled. I'm using CentOS, which is based on Red Hat. CentOS, Red Hat, Fedora, they all have Fackles turned on by default. Ubuntu also has Fackles turned on by default. So you probably do have it turned on and ready to rock. On a system that doesn't have it turned on, you would need to turn it on. And it's a little bit odd because it's not a service that runs. It's actually part of the file system. And so when your disk is mounted, that's when it determines whether or not it's going to allow these file system ACLs. On mine, when your system boots, it looks for a particular file, and that file is /etc/fstab or file system table, or fstab is what we usually call it. So if I look inside of the fstab file, what I'll see in there are all of my disks and where they're being mounted to. And they're being mounted with these UUIDs, which don't mean a whole lot to us humans, but these are unique identifiers for each disk, and I can see where they're mounted. So here's my home folder, my boot folder, and so on. So each of those mount points. And then I see that I'm using the XFS file system, and beside that, I see the file system options, right? Mine, just down the line, all say defaults, right? That means just do whatever Red Hat says the default should be, and on Ubuntu, it would be whatever Canonical says they should be, and those are what we're going to follow. But you might actually see the options truly written out. And there's things like you can choose to mount it as read-only, and you would see R-O right there, and maybe a comma and some other things that would define those options. Well, if you need to enable Fackles, what you would do is you would stick a comma on the end of that option and just write, comma, ACL. And that ACL option tells it to enable file system access control lists or Fackles. Once that's done, you have to unmount and remount the disk. And if it's your root partition, you're going to have to reboot because you can't unmount that one while your system is running. So usually the easiest thing to do is to add comma ACL to the options and then reboot. After everything remounts, now you'll have the file system ACLs. We can also just check and see if we've got them. When we work with file system ACLs, there's a couple of commands we use, but one of the most common is get FACL or get Fackle. If I want to view the file access control list of a file, this is the command I'm going to use. When I use ls-la, for example, or ls-l, and I'll pull up file4.txt, right? It's just showing me the Unix permissions. I see the U, G, and O permissions. But if I do get Fackle file4.txt, when I run that, it's actually going to look at the file and show me everything, right? Now, if I get that the command is not present, it's a pretty good chance that ACLs are not enabled or Fackles are not enabled on my system. If I run it and I get nothing back, that's an indicator that ACLs are not enabled on my file system. So that's kind of how we can test and see. But assuming that it's on and operational, you should see a response that comes back like mine, where I see the file name, I see who the owner and who the group are, and I see the UGO values. I don't see anything else because we haven't actually created anything yet. But we do actually see that the ACLs are turned on and enabled.
So, Don, how do we actually configure the Fackles?
Well, you know, in regular ACLs, we had chmod, right? You know, change the file bit mode, file mode bits. With Fackles, we have set Fackle. We just saw get Fackle, right? That gets it and returns list. And set Fackle, well, it sets the file access control. It's in the name.
It sets the Fackle.
I'm not setting a high bar for intelligence here, but we're setting the FACL. And when we do that, we're allowed to modify not just the new style Fackle permissions, but also the old style Unix. So you can use set Fackle to modify all of your permissions if you want. The command's pretty straightforward, but it is a little bit different than the way that chmod worked. For example, with chmod, I could specify those letters like U, G, and O with a plus or a minus if I was adding or taking away. With set Fackle, we actually have to use a command line option to say whether we're adding or taking away. So, for example, if I want to add permissions or take away permissions, I would use -M to show that I'm modifying. Or if I wanted to overwrite, I would use -S to say that I was setting. Setting would overwrite what was there currently. So let me show you an example. Let's say, looking at my files here, let's take file4, file4.txt. Right now, the user and the group have read and write, and everybody else has nothing. Maybe I want to give read access to everyone else. All right. Well, what I can do is say set FACL, and then I can say -M to show that I'm modifying. If I did -S, I would be setting and changing things. So I'm going to do -M. Then you specify what it is you're going to be changing. In my case, I'm going to be changing the O, the other, right? Now, you'll follow that by 2 colons. And what would happen is if this was the group or the user, I would specify the group or the user's name in between the colons. And if I left it out, it would be the default value. So if I left it out and it was the user, then it would be dpossessed. Or if it was the group, it would be sales, because that's what's already set there. But if I specify something different, then it would change that user. It would change that group. So we can actually do a lot of what we did with chown or change owner right from here as well. And then I'm adding to the others. I'm going to give them, let's see, I'm going to add, what will I add? We'll add read, right? So I'm just going to add the read permissions to it like that so that they'll be able to do that. And then I'll specify that it is file4.txt, okay? And when I run that, I can then pull up file4 and I see where they now have read access on the other side. So I use set FACL to do that. But where it gets really cool is when you add new entities to the list. So for example, right now these files are owned by dpossessed, okay? So I want to add Zach. I want Zach to have access to some of these files. I want him to have access to file4, and not just through the other. I want him to have explicit access on this file. So I can say set FACL -M, because I'm modifying, right? And because I don't want to overwrite the permissions that are already there. I'm going to do a u::Zach, that's his username, colon, and then I'm going to give him read and write access to file4.txt, right? When I do that, that's going to go in and add him in, right? I didn't do a set, so I didn't overwrite permissions. That would change it so that he became the user. But I did a modify, so it's tacking him onto the list. Now, if I do a ls-l for file4.txt, do you see Zach's name in there? No, right? And that's because these are the standard Unix permissions. They don't allow for more than one user. But you might notice there's a little plus sign that appeared, right? That plus sign is a visual indicator that tells you there's additional permissions you can't see. There's additional access control list entries. And if I do a get facle on file4.txt, then I'll see them. I can see that I am still the owner and sales is still the default group. I can see that me as the default owner, I have read and write, but here's another user, Zach, and he's got read and write as well. So now I've got more than one user tacked on, and I can have much more dynamic access and dynamic control. I can give a single person special privileges and tack that on, and that's way more flexible than the older Unix permissions.
Well, are group permissions handled the same way?
Oh, yeah. So let's go back to how I got on this whole tirade in the first place. If I have sales that has access, I want marketing to have access as well, right? So I want to grant them the ability to access this. I can come in and just say set FACL -M, because I'm, again, modifying. This time it's a group that I'm modifying, and it'll be marketing. And then I can give them read and write or whatever it is that I'm trying to assign out, and I'll give them that on file4.txt. I could do a directory or multiple files with a wildcard, so you've got certainly a lot of options there. So I'll assign that. And maybe I want to go a step further and give the accounting team just read access, right? So I'll run a similar command there to get that assigned. And if I do a get FACL on file4.txt, now I can see, again, I still have my regular permissions are set right there, and those are defined. I see Zach has permissions, and now marketing and accounting are specifically listed in here as well as having read, write, and read. So now we really get some power, and you start to see where this becomes far more useful than with the older style Unix permissions. So that's kind of a big deal, and definitely something that we need to make sure we set.
Don, do facals work with directories as well?
Yeah, so I mentioned like recursing across the directory, but we can actually set permissions on the directories too. So for example, I have a folder here, which I thought I called test, but I don't remember now. Yeah, test_files. So I have a folder called test files. And let's say that I want to allow the marketing and sales teams to be able to access that folder. Well, let's first, let's figure out what the permissions are on it in the first place. Let's see. Oh, it's being picky because it's a directory. You know what? Let me just pull the long listing here. All right, so here's test files. Directories are always fun. And I can see right now, I've got where the user has read, write, and execute, the group has read, write, and execute, and everybody else has read and execute. This thing's pretty wide open. All right. Well, I don't want everybody to have access to this folder. I want me and sales and marketing. Okay. Well, I'm the owner of it, and I'm the primary group for it too. Well, I can leave that be because I can always add sales and marketing with a FACL and achieve the same thing. So what we would do is come in and say set FACL -M because I'm modifying. And then here's where things get a little bit different. Normally, I would come in and specify, like here in my previous example, let me scroll back up, where we would specify if we were doing the group or a user, right? We would designate that. Here, we have to do a D first to indicate that we're messing with a directory. So I'm going to change a directory, and then I'm going to change the group on the directory, and I'll take marketing, and I'll add read and write for them. And this is going to be on the test files directory. Okay, that D:, that's an important indicator because it doesn't quite work unless you put that in there. And I'll do the same thing for sales. So otherwise, the command is exactly the same as we would use with files, just adding that D: to designate the directory. And once that's done, now it's working. In fact, we're doing a D: here, which looks like we're adding. With files, you actually do have an F:, right? But that's the default. It defaults to files, so you don't have to do it. But if you wanted to be consistent, you could do F:(G), blah, 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 and that way it would know that it was it was a file you were messing with. And if I do a get FACL on test files and take a look, so here's that directory. I'm still the owner and the primary group, but looking down here, I can see where I've got sales and marketing. They have the permissions assigned to that directory. I won't see that in my regular listing here, but I do see the plus letting me know that there's modified permissions to be found. And if I use get FACL, I will see those.
Are there any other advanced permissions we should be aware of?
You know, there are a couple of really weird permissions. We're going to talk about SUID and GUID permissions a little bit later on, which is where you change the execution context of a file. They're a bit of a security risk. That's why we need to learn about them. But there is one other one I want to mention, and that's called the sticky bit.
Oh, the sticky bit.
The sticky bit. This is a fun one. You know, looking at our permissions here, we saw where we had like read, write, and execute, RWX, or a hyphen if you had nothing, or maybe every now and then a little plus sign if there were additional permissions. But sometimes you might look in there and see the letter T. And T's a really weird one. Like, why would I have this T? What does that stand for? It stands for the sticky bit. And what the sticky bit is designed for are shared folders. Let's say you have a folder that's just called something like your corporate data folder, right? So I'm going to make a directory called corp data, all right? And I share this folder out so everybody in the company can put documents in that folder. So Zach has read and write on the folder, and I have read and write on the folder. I could put a document in there, and then Zach could go in and he could say, oh, I hate that Don guy, delete the document, right? Because he has read and write, he can do that, right? One user could mess with another user's documents, even though it's designed to be a place for everybody to put their stuff. What the sticky bit does is it says, all right, when somebody creates a document in this folder, we're going to assign the permissions so that only the person who created the file can delete the file. That everybody can read it, sure, maybe everybody can write to it also. But in order to delete it, you've got to be either root, you've got to have super user power, or you have to be the person who created it. And so StickyBit tells the folder to watch for when people create documents to be able to tack that on and keep track of who created it. It's a really important thing to do. So taking my corp data folder as an example, I can turn on that sticky bit by using chmod, and you can set the sticky bit based on the user or the group. Group's kind of handy because you might say, you know what, I need marketing to have write access to the sales folder, but I don't want the marketing team to be able to delete the sales folder stuff. I want them to change, but not delete. So you can set the sticky bit on the group. So now everything would be kind of tied to the sales team. It's up to you. But a lot of times we'll do it based on the owner, the individual people. So you would say chmod O plus T. O plus T. Not RWX, but O plus T. If I want to do the group, I would say G plus T, or I could even do both. I could just do a comma and G plus T to add it for the group too. But I'll just stick with the owner. And I'm going to do that on the corp data folder. Okay. Once that's done, if I pull up my listing and I find corp data, notice how corp data, it's highlighted in blue. It's different than the other directories. And that's because if I look at those permissions over there, oops, hang on, let me see if I can get my Zoom working. There we go. If I look at those permissions, I see a T stuck here at the end, right? Not an X for other, and it is kind of on the other permissions because it doesn't want to mask whether or not I have execute as the owner. So it sticks that T down there at the end to say, oh, by the way, the sticky bit is set on this. And now when people go in and create files inside of there, we're going to see some interesting things. So for example, let me go into corp data. All right. And I'm logged in as me. So I'm going to create a file, which I'll just call don.txt. So I'm creating a file. And then maybe I switch to the JDoe user. All right. And he will, oh, I don't know if I set the permissions for him. So we'll have to find out. He might not have permission to write. He doesn't. Who would? Zach, you should, right?
Yay.
So let me SU over to Zach. And, oh, shoot, that's going to, darn it.
Oh, no.
It's going to put me in the wrong folder. So if I remember what I set your password to when I created your account. Well, anyhow, if I come in as another user, remembering their password is going to be an important part of this secret. But once you get in there, you can go in and create files, and they'll automatically have that bit set as well. If I take a look at what's in here right now, there's that Don text, and it's got me set as the owner and the group. And as other people start to create files, their information will get set appropriately as well. To make sure they have that access and that we can't delete things from inside of there unless we're the owner. We're the ones that create that. It doesn't really look different here on the permissions, though, for the user. See how, like my file, there's really nothing in here that indicates it's different. And that's because it's not a behavior of the file. It's a behavior of the folder that it's in, the directory. And so that's where we set the sticky bit. Sticky bit is set on the directory, not on the individual files. It makes no sense to set it on the individual file because at that point, it's already been created. It's already got permission. So the directory is where it needs to get defined. But that's an interesting one. If you ever see a T pop up in there, that's an indicator that you have the sticky bit.
Awesome. Advanced permissions. That's what you've been watching. And before we move on, Don, would you like to add anything?
The only other one I want to mention, I briefly mentioned Suid and Guid, which sets a program to always execute as a certain user regardless of who's running it. It's a fairly dangerous thing, and that'll usually make files show up in a bright red in their file name. So if you ever see red files pop out, that's a kind of a big warning sign that, whoop, somebody set that bit. That is an extra permission, but we're going to cover it later on in this series, not in this particular episode.
Thank you, Don. Well done as usual. CompTIA Linux Plus is a fantastic series. Make sure you pay attention to each and every episode. I'm sure you will. And you know what? There's supplementary information, and that's in our course library. And it's there to do one thing, help you be even more successful. So check that out, too. And tell everybody you know about IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV is binge-worthy. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We will see you again soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.